Why peasants travelled at all. So, picture this. You're a poor peasant in medieval Europe. You spend your days working the same little strip of land, digging in the dirt, planting, harvesting, maybe milking the family goat if you're lucky enough to own one. Most of the time, life is about survival, not adventure. Food is basic, clothing is patched together, and travel isn't exactly something you do for fun. You don't just wake up and say, "You know what? I'm bored of this mud hut. Let's take a holiday in Paris." No. For most peasants, travel was rare. Your whole world was basically your village, the fields around it, and maybe, if you were adventurous, the next town over. But every so often, something would drag you out of your normal routine and put you on the road. So why would a poor peasant actually travel? Let's break it down. 1. Pilgrimages. Religion was a huge deal in medieval life. Everyone, from kings to peasants, believed that the soul needed regular maintenance like a cosmic oil change. Pilgrimages were basically spiritual road trips. A peasant might decide to walk, sometimes hundreds of miles, to visit a holy site. Why? Maybe they wanted forgiveness for sins. Maybe they hoped a saint's shrine could heal a sickness. Sometimes it was a sort of spiritual insurance policy. Go see the relics now, in the hope of better chances in the afterlife. For peasants, pilgrimages were tough. They had no money for fancy inns, so it meant sleeping rough, begging food along the way, and hoping they didn't get robbed. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Pilgrimages also gave peasants a chance to leave their tiny bubble, meet new people, and see a world beyond their muddy fields. For some, it was the most exciting thing that ever happened in their entire lives. 2. Markets and fairs. Another reason for travel. Markets. Villages often didn't produce everything people needed. If you wanted salt, cloth, or maybe a nice knife, you had to go to a market. Local markets were sometimes just a few miles away, but bigger fairs could mean long journeys. These markets weren't just about buying and selling. They were social events. Imagine being stuck with the same 30 people every day of your life. And then suddenly you get to see hundreds of faces, hear different accents, maybe even taste exotic food. It was like going from a small-town diner to Times Square. For peasants, markets were a little glimpse of the bigger world. Of course, travel for trade came with risks. Bandits loved the fact that peasants might be carrying a bit of coin or a sack of goods. And then there was the issue of where you'd sleep. Hint, not the Hilton. We'll get to that in later chapters. 3. Weddings and family events. Sometimes, peasants hit the road for family matters. If your cousin was getting married in the next village, you packed up your cloak, maybe brought a chicken as a gift, and set out. Weddings were one of the few times peasants could actually celebrate, eat better food than usual, and maybe drink until they forgot about their aching backs. Traveling for these events was a way to keep family ties alive. Remember? No phones, no letters, no texting your cousin about what time to show up. If you didn't physically travel, you just missed out. 4. Seasonal work. Some peasants weren't tied to land. They traveled for work. Harvest time, building projects, clearing forests, or repairing roads. These were migrant workers before the term existed. They'd go where labor was needed, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. This was risky, but necessary. If a peasant's home harvest failed, working elsewhere could mean the difference between survival and starvation. It also meant living in barns, sheds, or under the stars. Pretty rough, but better than nothing. 5. Military service or forced travel. Not all travel was voluntary. Sometimes peasants were dragged along in wars, whether as soldiers, laborers, or supply carriers. Lords could demand service, and peasants had little choice. This kind of travel was dangerous, exhausting, and often deadly, but it happened often enough that it was part of peasant life. 6. Escaping trouble. There was also the less noble reason, running away. Maybe you owed taxes. Maybe you got into trouble with the local bailiff. Maybe you just couldn't stand your lord anymore. Running away to another village or town was risky, since your whole identity was tied to your land and lord, but desperate peasants sometimes took the gamble. Of course, being caught meant punishment, so it wasn't exactly a relaxing holiday. 7. Festivals and religious holidays. Lastly, peasants sometimes travelled for festivals, religious feasts, saints' days, or annual celebrations. These were chances to enjoy music, food, and dancing, a welcome break from endless labour. Some were local, but bigger ones could draw people from miles around. It wasn't exactly vacation, but it was about as close as medieval peasants got. Wrapping up the why so, when you picture a peasant travelling, don't imagine them strolling down a cobblestone street with a suitcase and a guidebook. Imagine someone with a patched cloak, worn shoes, and maybe a crust of bread in their pouch. They weren't going for fun. Travel usually meant obligation, religion, work, survival, or family, but in its own way, it was exciting. For a peasant who spent nearly every waking moment staring at the same few fields, the road was a taste of freedom. It was a break from routine, even if it came with sore feet, empty stomachs, and plenty of risk. And now that we know why peasants would leave their homes in the first place, we can move on to the real question. Once they were on the road, where did they actually sleep? Spoiler, it wasn't glamorous. Roads and routes of the common folk. Okay, so we've figured out why poor peasants actually travelled. Pilgrimages, markets, weddings, work, or just running away from debts. Plenty of reasons to hit the road. But now let's actually look at those roads, because when we say road in the Middle Ages, don't picture a nice paved street with neat little signposts. Oh no, the reality was, well, let's just say your shoes weren't going to stay clean for long. 1. The medieval roads for peasants. Most roads weren't really roads at all. They were dirt tracks, worn down by the hooves of animals and the feet of travellers. Rain turned them into mud pits, and in summer they dried into rutted, uneven trails. Only the biggest, most important routes, the ones left behind by the Romans, were paved with stone, and even those, centuries later, were falling apart. Most peasants never got to see a Roman road. Instead, they dealt with paths so narrow you could barely walk side by side. If you brought a cart, you were in for a bumpy ride. So yeah, when people say the road was rough, they meant it literally. 2. Signposts. Forget it. How did peasants know where to go? Well, there were no Google Maps, no paper maps stuffed in your bag, and almost no road signs. Directions were usually based on landmarks. Follow the river, go past the big oak tree, turn left at the ruined mill. Travelers often relied on word of mouth, asking villagers along the way, or tagging along with others who knew the route. If you lost track of the path, you might end up wandering through the woods, hoping you weren't circling back to where you started. And yes, that happened more than once. 3. Hazards along the way. Traveling the roads wasn't just about the mud. There were all sorts of hazards, thieves and bandits. Some areas were notorious for robbers hiding in forests or waiting near crossroads. A peasant wasn't carrying much, but even a crust of bread or a cheap knife could be worth stealing. Wild animals, wolves, bears, and wild boars roamed parts of Europe. Traveling alone at night, bad idea. Floods and weather. A heavy rain could wash out a road, or worse, a bridge. If the river flooded, well, you might be stuck until it went down again. Basically, the road trip vibe was more hope I survived than singing in the car with friends. 4. Crossing rivers. Rivers were both highways and obstacles. There weren't many bridges, and the ones that existed often had tolls. If you couldn't afford the toll, you waded through, risking wet clothes and maybe even drowning if the current was strong. Ferrymen offered rides across, but again, not free. For peasants travelling on a tight budget, which was always, this was stressful. Do you pay? Do you risk the river? Either way, you weren't staying dry. 5. Who maintained the roads? Here is the thing, nobody really did. Local lords sometimes had peasants repair roads as part of their duties, filling holes with stones or trimming backbrush, but maintenance was patchy at best. Inns and towns wanted better roads for merchants, but out in the countryside, you were basically on your own. If the track washed out, you just found a new track next to it. Over time, roads wandered across the landscape, lazy rivers. 6. Travel pay. So, How fast could a peasant move? On foot, maybe 15 to 20 miles a day if the weather was good and the road wasn't awful. With a cart or animals, much slower. That means even short trips took days. Going 50 miles, that's not an afternoon stroll. That's half a week of walking, with sore feet, empty stomachs, and trying to figure out where to sleep each night. 7. Landmarks and crossroads. Despite the lack of signs, some places became famous stopping points. A big crossroads, a shrine, or even a giant tree, it served as a kind of medieval GPS marker. Pilgrims sometimes carved little signs or left offerings at these spots. And of course, crossroads had their own spooky reputation. People told stories about ghosts, witches, or the devil himself appearing where roads met. So not only were crossroads confusing, they were also creepy. Nice combo. 8. Town gates and rules. When peasants finally reached a town, the journey wasn't over. Many towns had gates that closed at night. If you arrived late, tough luck. You slept outside the walls, exposed to the elements. Inside towns, roads were slightly better, but still crowded with mud, animals, and people. At least you had more options for shelter, though most of them cost money. 9. Why peasants still managed given all this? You might wonder, why didn't peasants just avoid the roads altogether? Well, sometimes they did. Travelers cut through fields, walked along riverbanks, or followed animal trails, but the main paths, rough as they were still safer and more predictable than wandering completely off course. And peasants weren't helpless. They were tough, used to rough conditions, and traveled light. They weren't dragging trunks of clothing, just a cloak, maybe a walking stick, and a small bundle of food. Simpler lives made for simpler travel, even if it wasn't comfortable. Wrapping up the road so. That's the medieval road system for poor peasants, muddy, dangerous, confusing, and exhausting. Not exactly a postcard-worthy adventure, but it was the reality of moving from village to village. If you were lucky, you made it to your destination with nothing worse than blisters. If you were unlucky, well, let's just say people disappeared on the road all the time. But for all the hardship, the roads connected the medieval world. They linked villages to markets, pilgrims to shrines, and workers to fields. Without them, peasants would have been stuck in their little bubbles forever. Now that we know what it was like just to walk from A to B, let's get to the real heart of the question. When peasants finally stopped walking for the day, where did they actually sleep? Spoiler, it wasn't glamorous, but sometimes it was surprisingly cozy. Staying in villages along the way so, imagine you're a poor peasant who's been walking all day. Your shoes are basically leather socks with holes, your stomach is grumbling, and the sun is dipping behind the hills. You're not looking for luxury, you just want somewhere to sit, maybe something to eat, and most importantly a place to sleep that isn't a puddle. Lucky for you, medieval Europe was dotted with villages, and villages meant people. And where there were people, there was always the chance, however small, that somebody might give you a spot to rest. 1. Knocking on doors. Hospitality was kind of a cultural expectation in many places. If a weary traveler showed up at your door, it was seen as decent, even godly, to offer them shelter. That didn't mean you got a comfy bed. More often than not, it meant, here is a corner of the floor, don't step on the chickens. Poor travelers might be invited into the main room of a cottage, where the whole family slept anyway. Beds were usually shared, straw mattresses at best, sometimes just sacks stuffed with hay. If the family was generous, you'd get a blanket. If not, you curled up in your cloak and hoped for the best. 2. Barns and stables. If the main house was too crowded, you might end up in the barn or stable. Not glamorous, but hay-warm animals, soft hay, and a roof over your head. A barn was practically a budget hotel by peasant standards. You might even joke to yourself, 5-star hay, would recommend. Of course, it wasn't perfect. The smell wasn't exactly lavender, and if you had allergies, well, tough luck. But a barn beats sleeping outside in the rain, no question. 3. Why villagers helped. So why would strangers take in random peasants? Well, partly because of Christian duty. Offering food and shelter to travelers was seen as a good deed, something that could bring you blessings. There was always that whisper in the back of people's minds, what if this stranger was some kind of test from God? Better to give a crust of bread than risk divine punishment. There was also the practical side. Travelers carried news. A wandering peasant might know about prices at a distant market, or rumors of trouble, or even funny stories. Villages were small, and news from the outside world was valuable. So, giving someone a meal and a spot on the floor could mean good gossip later. 4. Food and drink. Don't expect a feast. If you were lucky, you got a bowl of pottage, basically a thick soup made of whatever was lying around. Peas, beans, oats, maybe a sliver of bacon if times were good. Bread was common, though often coarse and heavy. Drink was usually weak ale or water. For a weary traveller, though, even humble food tasted like a banquet. After all, it beat chewing on stale crusts while sitting in a ditch. 5. Sleeping arrangements. Now, let's talk about the actual sleeping part. In many cottages, everyone already slept together: parents, children, sometimes even animals. Privacy wasn't really a thing. Adding one more traveller into the mix didn't seem that strange. You might squeeze onto the edge of a straw bed, or just stretch out by the hearth. If you were in a barn, you made yourself a little nest in the hay, hopefully not too close to the cow, unless you enjoyed being woken up by mooing at dawn. 6. The risk of staying with strangers. Of course, staying with villagers wasn't always safe. Not everyone was kind. There were risks of being robbed, cheated, or simply turned away. A poor traveller might knock on a dozen doors before anyone let them in, and sometimes hospitality came with strings attached: chores, heavy labour, or expectations of repayment. But most peasants understood hardship. They knew what it was like to be hungry and tired, and that shared experience often made people generous, at least in small ways. 7. The social side of hospitality. One underrated part of staying in a village was the social connection. Imagine sitting by someone's hearth, listening to the family tell stories, hearing local gossip, and sharing a laugh before bed. For a traveller, that warmth was just as valuable as the food. And for the villagers, a visitor was entertainment. No Netflix, no radio, just a stranger with new tales. Hospitality wasn't only kindness, it was a chance to break the monotony of daily life. 8. When villages turned you away. Of course, sometimes you weren't welcome. Maybe the village was struggling with famine. Maybe they didn't trust outsiders. Or maybe they just didn't want another mouth to feed. In that case, you'd be pointed back toward the road, forced to try your luck for the next settlement. That rejection could mean a long, cold night outdoors, which is why peasants often traveled in groups. More chance of finding shelter, more safety if they were turned away. 9. The blessing of a roof. At the end of the day, though, a roof was a roof. Whether it was a cottage corner, a stable full of animals, or just the covered porch of a village hall, it was better than nothing. For peasants, comfort was relative. Dry straw and a crust of bread were luxuries compared to the alternative. And so, village hospitality became a lifeline for poor travelers. Without it, most peasants simply couldn't have managed to journey anywhere. Wrapping up the villages. So, when you picture a poor peasant traveling through the countryside, don't imagine them walking confidently into an inn and ordering a room. Picture them knocking on doors at dusk, hoping some kind soul would say yes. Picture them curled up on hay in a stranger's barn, or stretched out by a smoky hearth. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was human. Villages kept peasants alive on the road, one crust of bread and one corner of floor at a time. Next, we'll head to another common shelter for travelers, the church. Because when all else failed, peasants could sometimes rely on the mercy of monks and the shelter of stone walls. Sleeping in churches and monasteries. So, you've been on the road all day. Your feet feel like lumps of wood, your cloak is damp from the drizzle, and the last village you passed through wasn't exactly welcoming. The barn was full, the cottage door stayed shut, and the best you got was a suspicious dog barking at you. Not ideal. Where do you turn? Well, in the Middle Ages, There was one place that almost always had its doors open to travelers: the church. 1. The church as a refuge. Churches weren't just for Sunday services. They were the beating heart of medieval communities. Weddings, funerals, festivals, even meetings about village disputes, all of it happened at the church. And beyond that, the church also acted as a refuge. For travelers, especially poor ones, a church was often the safest bet for shelter. Some churches kept a corner for wanderers. Some had porches where travelers could curl up for the night. Others had connected monasteries or abbeys that actively welcomed strangers. It wasn't luxury, but it was dry, it was safe, and most importantly, it was free. 2. Monastic hospitality. Monasteries took hospitality seriously. Monks believed in treating strangers as though they were Christ himself, wandering the earth in disguise. That meant offering food, drink, and shelter, no matter how humble. Many monasteries had special guest halls for travelers. These weren't designed for comfort, they were more like large dormitories. Picture a long room with straw pallets on the floor, a few blankets, and maybe a wooden bench if you were lucky. You'd be sleeping shoulder to shoulder with other peasants, pilgrims, and whoever else happened to wander in. But compared to shivering outside, it felt like a palace. 3. What you got to eat. Food at monasteries was plain but filling. Travelers might be offered bread, cheese, soup, or maybe a bit of ale. Nothing fancy, but enough to take the edge off hunger. Some abbeys were wealthier and could spare more, especially for pilgrims traveling to famous shrines. But for the everyday peasant, even a bowl of watery pottage and a crust of bread was a blessing. And there was another benefit. No one was going to rob you in a monastery. The monks might be strict, but they weren't thieves. 4. Rules and conditions. Of course, church hospitality came with a few strings attached. For 1. You might be expected to attend prayers or services. The monks weren't just feeding you for free, they hoped to feed your soul too. Some monasteries had limits, like one night only for poor travelers, unless you had a really good reason to stay longer. Pilgrims often got more leniency, since their journey was religious, and monks weren't naive. They knew some people tried to abuse hospitality. Chronic freeloaders might find themselves quietly shown the door. 5. Sleeping in the church itself. If the monastery wasn't an option, peasants sometimes just slept inside the church building. The stone walls kept out the weather, and the atmosphere was peaceful, if a little spooky at night. Imagine lying down near the altar, all tucked against the wall, the flicker of a candle lighting the stained glass windows. Not exactly the Ritz, but it had a certain charm. And for believers, there was comfort in sleeping surrounded by holy things. 6. The porch option. In smaller villages, the church porch was the go-to shelter. These covered entryways had roofs, and sometimes benches. A tired traveler could curl up there and stay dry, at least mostly. The downside: anyone walking past could see you, which wasn't the most private situation. But for peasants who had nothing to hide and nowhere else to go, the porch was a lifesaver. 7. Pilgrims and hospitals. Churches also ran special hostels and hospitals for pilgrims. These weren't hospitals in the modern sense, more like way stations for the sick, the poor, and travelers. Pilgrims could expect a bed in a shared dormitory, a simple meal, and plenty of sermons. Hospitals were often crowded, noisy, and not always hygienic. Disease spread easily, and the beds weren't exactly comfortable, but they were still far safer than the open road. 8. A place of safety. One huge advantage of churches was protection. Churches were considered sacred spaces. To harm someone inside was a big deal, like risk your soul kind of deal. For peasants traveling alone, that was priceless. If you'd had a run-in with bandits, or if you just didn't feel safe, the church was the place to run. Nobody wanted to be the guy who robbed a traveler in front of the Virgin Mary. 9. The spiritual comfort. Beyond the physical shelter, there was the spiritual side. For peasants, life was full of fear: bad harvests, sickness, violence. Sleeping in a church was like resting under God's direct protection. Even if the straw mattress was lumpy and the stone floor was cold, There was peace of mind in knowing you were safe in his house, and 4 monks, offering that peace was part of their duty. They weren't just feeding bodies, they were caring for souls. 10. Not always perfect now. Let's not romanticize it too much. Churches could be drafty. Monasteries could be strict. And not every monk was thrilled about peasants tracking mud through their cloisters. Some travelers found themselves treated with suspicion, or turned away if the house was too full. But compared to the alternatives, rain-soaked ditches, lonely forests, or hostile strangers, churches were still some of the best places for a peasant to spend the night. Wrapping up the monastery stay. So, where did peasants stay when the road was long and the night was cold? Often at the feet of the church, whether that meant a straw pallet in a monastery guest hall, a bench in the porch, or a quiet corner inside the nave. The church was one of the most reliable shelters a traveler could find. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even all that comfortable, but it offered safety, food, and a touch of the sacred, all things a weary peasant desperately needed. Next, well, look at what happened when the church wasn't an option, because sometimes peasants had no choice but to sleep under the stars, out in the open countryside, with wolves howling in the distance, roadsides and the great outdoors. All right, so let's say you've had no luck with villages. The barns are full, nobody opens their doors, and the church is locked up tight for the night. The sun has gone down, the sky is dark, and you've got nowhere to go. What now? Well, for many poor peasants, the answer was simple. You slept outside. Just you, the dirt, the stars, and hopefully not too many bugs. 1. The open air option. Sleeping outdoors wasn't a rare emergency, it was pretty normal. If you couldn't find a roof, you just made do with what you had. A cloak doubled as a blanket, and if you had a bundle of straw or hay, even better. It might sound a little romantic, campfires under the stars, fresh air, maybe an owl hooting softly in the distance. But reality, it was often cold, wet, and uncomfortable. And that owl, probably eyeing your leftovers. 2. Ditches, trees, and hedgerows. Where exactly did peasants sleep outside? They looked for cover. Ditches on the side of the road were common, low enough to be out of the wind, and maybe hidden from passing thieves. Trees were another option, offering at least some shelter from rain. Hedgerows, those thick, tangled bushes used to mark fields, were also handy. Curl up next to one, and you might stay a little warmer. Not cozy, but practical. Think of it like the medieval version of couch surfing, only the couch is mud and leaves. 3. Cloaks and bedding. Most peasants didn't own proper bedding. A cloak was the closest thing to a blanket. Cloaks were heavy, woolen, and surprisingly good at keeping out cold and damp. They weren't perfect, but they were better than nothing. If a traveler had straw or hay, they might spread it on the ground to make a kind of mattress. Straw doesn't sound glamorous, but it was warmer than sleeping directly on the dirt. It also helped keep away creepy crawlies, at least a little. 4. Campfires. If you had flint and tinder, or if you were traveling with others, you might light a small fire. Fire meant warmth, light, and some protection from animals, but it also meant visibility. A glowing fire could attract unwanted attention, whether from bandits or nosy locals who thought you were up to no good. So peasants had to weigh the risk. Do you freeze quietly, or do you risk being found by the wrong people? Neither option was great. 5. The weather problem. Weather was a constant enemy. A clear summer night was fine, but in autumn or winter, miserable. Imagine trying to sleep while your cloak soaks through with rain. Your teeth are chattering, and every gust of wind makes you wish you'd stayed home. Snow was even worse. Unless you dug yourself into a haystack or found a barn, sleeping outside in winter could be deadly. Peasants knew this, which is why many avoided long journeys in the cold months, unless they absolutely had to. 6. The dangers of the night. Sleeping outside also meant risks from animals. Wolves were still present in many parts of Europe. A lone traveler in the woods might hear howls in the distance and not sleep a wink. Wild boars were another danger, aggressive, powerful, and not afraid of people. Then there were human threats. Bandits and thieves knew travelers often had no choice but to camp outside. A poor peasant might not carry much, but even a scrap of food was worth stealing. Sometimes travelers slept hidden in bushes or ditches just to avoid being spotted. 7. Traveling in groups. Because of these dangers, peasants often traveled together. Groups could make campfires, share food, and take turns keeping watch. It was safer, and honestly, less lonely. Sitting by a fire with a few companions, sharing bread and stories, was probably the closest thing peasants had to a medieval camping trip. But again, don't picture happy marshmallow roasting. Picture a circle of tired people huddled against the cold, chewing stale bread, and hoping wolves kept their distance. 8. Songs and stories by the fire. Still, there were bright spots. Medieval peasants loved songs and tales. On the road, a campfire became a place to tell stories, legends of saints, tales of local heroes, or just funny gossip from the last village. Music, laughter, and storytelling made the hardship easier. So while the ground was hard and the night was long, there was at least some human warmth to balance the cold. 9. Morning realities. Waking up outdoors wasn't glamorous either. Your cloak might be damp, your back sore, and your stomach empty. Dew soaked everything, so even dry straw felt wet in the morning, and if you'd slept in a ditch, chances were high you woke up muddy. Still, peasants were used to discomfort. They got up, stretched, brushed off the dirt, and hit the road again. Life didn't pause because you had a bad night's sleep. 10. Why it was normal. Here is the key. Peasants didn't expect comfort. Sleeping outside wasn't some shocking hardship, it was just part of life. Many peasants were too poor to even dream of a proper bed every night. So the roadside, a hedgerow, or a campfire became the normal fallback. It wasn't safe, it wasn't warm, and it wasn't fun, but it worked, and for peasants, good enough was usually as good as things got. Wrapping up the outdoors. Stay. So when people ask, where did poor peasants sleep while traveling? The honest answer, a lot of the time, is wherever they could. A ditch, a tree, a haystack, or just the bare ground under the stars. It wasn't cozy, it wasn't romantic, but it kept them moving from one place to another, step by weary step. Next, we'll take a look at the slightly more official option, inns and taverns. Because yes, peasants did sometimes end up in inns, but don't go picturing private rooms and clean sheets. We're talking crowded, noisy, and smelly. Basically, medieval hostels without the free Wi-Fi. Inns for the poor, kind of alright. So you've survived the muddy roads, dodged the wolves, and somehow made it through a cold night in a ditch. Lucky you, you've stumbled across an inn. Finally 4 walls, maybe some food, maybe even a bed. Sounds great, right? Well, hold on. When we say inn, don't imagine a cozy little tavern from a fantasy movie, with roaring fires, cheerful music, and a friendly innkeeper polishing mugs behind the bar. Medieval inns, especially the ones a poor peasant could afford, were, let's just say, a lot less glamorous. 1. Not all inns were equal. Inns came in many shapes and sizes. Some catered to merchants and travelers with money. Big halls, decent meals, even private rooms. Those were way out of reach for peasants. If you were poor, you aimed for the humbler end of the spectrum. Alehouses, taverns, or small roadside lodgings. These places weren't fancy. They were loud, smoky, and crowded. The air smelled like beer, sweat, and maybe a hint of something you didn't want to think too hard about. But they had one thing peasants desperately needed: a roof. 2. Sleeping on the floor. If a peasant managed to scrape together a few coins, they might get permission to sleep inside an alehouse or inn. But that didn't mean a bed. More often, it meant a spot on the floor, usually in the common room. You spread your cloak, curled up near the fire if you were lucky, and tried to sleep while people argued, drank, and sang around you. Privacy, forget it. Comfort, also forget it. But hey, you weren't outside in the rain, and sometimes that was enough. 3. Shared beds and straw mattresses. If you had a little more money, some inns offered space in shared beds or straw mattresses in lofts or outbuildings. Shared beds were exactly what they sound like: multiple strangers crammed together, shoulder to shoulder, sometimes even head to foot. It wasn't weird in medieval times. People were used to less personal space, but for a modern person, the idea of sleeping next to 3 sweaty strangers while everyone snores and coughs, not ideal. Straw mattresses, meanwhile, were usually stuffed with old hay, crawling with bugs, and smelled faintly of animals. But again, better than mud. 4. Taverns as hotels. Taverns doubled as social hubs. Travelers, villagers, and workers gathered to drink weak ale, swap stories, and occasionally brawl. If you stayed at a tavern, you didn't just get shelter, you got noise. Lots of noise. Imagine trying to drift off while a group of drunken farmers argued about pigs, someone sang loudly off-key, and the innkeeper's dog barked at every shadow. Sleep wasn't guaranteed, but warmth, food, and company, those you could count on. 5. Paying the bill. So how much did it cost? Prices varied wildly, but even the cheapest inns weren't free. A peasant might pay with coins, if they had them, or with barter, like offering a chicken, some eggs, or labor. Sometimes, if you couldn't pay, the innkeeper might let you sweep floors, chop wood, or muck out stables in exchange for a night indoors. It wasn't charity, it was business. But for peasants with empty purses, work for shelter deals were lifesavers. 6. Food and drink inside. What about the food? Inns and taverns served hearty, but simple meals: bread, pottage, cheese, maybe some meat if you were lucky, and of course, ale. Always ale. Water wasn't safe to drink in many places, so weak ale was the go-to beverage. The quality varied. Some inns were famous for good cooking. Others were infamous for watery stew and stale bread. For a hungry traveller, though, even bad stew tasted heavenly after a day on the road. 7. The risky side of inns. Not every inn was safe. Some were shady, run by innkeepers who didn't mind turning a blind eye to theft or even robbery. A peasant might go to sleep with a coin pouch and wake up with nothing. There were even tales of travellers disappearing altogether, robbed, killed, and buried in the back garden. Most inns weren't that sinister, but peasants weren't naive. They slept lightly, kept their belongings close, and trusted no one too quickly. 8. Inns versus hospitality compared to staying in a village cottage or church. Inns were less personal. You paid, you got a space, and that was it. There wasn't much warmth or generosity, but inns did offer consistency. You didn't have to knock on doors, beg for food, or risk being turned away. If you had the money, you had a place. For many peasants, that security, knowing you had a guaranteed roof, was worth the price, even if the roof leaked. 9. A rare treat for the poor. For the very poorest, inns were rare luxuries. Most peasants couldn't afford them often, but once in a while, maybe during a long pilgrimage, or after saving up from seasonal work, a night in an inn feel like a small holiday. Sure, the straw mattress was lumpy, and the guy snoring next to you smelled like cabbage, but it was still an upgrade from the roadside ditch. 10. Inns as meeting places. There was another perk: meeting people. Inns brought together all sorts: merchants, messengers, wandering friars, soldiers, and peasants. A traveller could pick up news, hear stories from faraway towns, or even catch a song from a passing minstrel. For peasants who spent most of their lives in tiny villages, inns were windows to the wider world. Crowded, noisy, and smelly windows, but windows nonetheless, wrapping up the inexperience. So, what was it like for peasants to stay in inns? In short, chaotic. They were noisy, crowded, often dirty, but also lively. They offered food, drink, warmth, and most importantly, a roof. For poor travellers, inns weren't everyday stops. They were occasional shelters, used when there was no Kindle option, or when you had just enough coin to trade mud and hay for straw and ale. Next, well, look at the rules of hospitality that shaped all of this, because believe it or not, there were actual laws and traditions that said villages and towns had to help travellers, and sometimes those rules were the only reason a peasant didn't end up sleeping in a ditch. Hospitality laws and traditions. So far, we've seen poor peasants sleep in barns, churches, ditches, and noisy inns. But here is the thing: in medieval Europe, There were actually rules, both written and unwritten, that said you should take in travelers. Hospitality wasn't just a nice extra. In many places, it was considered a duty. That doesn't mean peasants on the road always got the royal treatment, but these customs and laws did shape how people were received, and sometimes they made the difference between sleeping under a roof and sleeping in a puddle. 1. The sacred duty of hospitality. Hospitality wasn't just politeness, it was tied to religion. In Christian Europe, offering shelter to a traveler was seen as a good deed. The Bible was full of stories about welcoming strangers, and priests reminded villagers that helping the poor was a way of serving God. So when a peasant knocked on a door asking for food or a place to rest, it wasn't just begging, it was leaning on a tradition. Turning someone away wasn't just rude. In some eyes, it was sinful. 2. Pilgrims and hospitality. One of the biggest drivers of hospitality laws was pilgrimage. Every year, thousands of people set off to holy sites: Canterbury, Santiago, Rome, Jerusalem. Not everyone on the road was a pilgrim, but the sheer number of them meant communities had to figure out how to handle constant travelers. Villages near popular routes often had rules or expectations. Pilgrims would be fed, given shelter, or at least offered space in barns or churchyards. Sometimes entire hospices or guest houses were built just for them. And here is the funny part. Even if you weren't a pilgrim, being mistaken for one sometimes helped. A poor traveler might carry a staff or a shell, symbols of pilgrimage, and people were more willing to help. 3. Monasteries and hospitality. Monasteries took hospitality especially seriously. Many had a special guest house, sometimes grand for rich visitors, sometimes simple for the poor. Monks believed serving strangers was part of serving God. Even the poorest peasant might get a roof, bread, and broth for the night. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe and warm. For travelers, monasteries were like medieval rest stops, rare but reliable. 4. Civic rules and lodging laws. As towns grew in the later Middle Ages, hospitality became less about personal kindness and more about civic order. Some towns had laws requiring inns to take in strangers. Others fined citizens for refusing shelter to travelers. In England, for example, vagrancy laws later made it clear that wandering without purpose was suspicious. But earlier, there were also local customs that pressured people to help those on the road. Basically, feed them, or they might starve, and then it's on your conscience. 5. Hospitality as survival. Remember, medieval roads weren't safe. Bandits, wolves, storms, sickness, travel was risky. Hospitality wasn't just charity, it was survival. If no one ever helped travelers, fewer people would make journeys. Trade, pilgrimages, and even news would grind to a halt. So hospitality wasn't only about being nice, it was practical. Communities benefited when people on the road stayed alive. 6. The flip side. Suspicion of strangers. Of course, not everyone followed these customs. While hospitality was praised, strangers were also feared. A traveler might be a thief, a spy, or carry disease. So even when laws or traditions said open your door, people hesitated. This is why many peasants ended up in barns or stables instead of the main house. Hospitality was offered, but with distance. You'd get food and shelter, but maybe not trust. 7. Hospitality and reputation for villagers. Showing hospitality was also about reputation. A generous household earned respect. A stingy one got whispered about. Nobody wanted to be the family known for slamming doors in pilgrims' faces. Some landowners and lords even used hospitality as a way to boost their image. Hosting travelers generously showed off their wealth and piety. For peasants, it was on a smaller scale, but the same principle. Helping strangers was part of being seen as good and godly. 8. Church pressure. The church kept the pressure on. Sermons, saints' tales, and local priests reminded people that refusing a traveler could mean refusing Christ himself, because, in Christian thought, God could appear as a stranger at any time. That's a lot of guilt to carry if you shut the door. So even poor households sometimes gave more than they could afford, fearing spiritual punishment if they didn't. 9. Generosity versus reality. Still, we shouldn't imagine medieval Europe as one big free Airbnb. Hospitality was expected, but reality often fell short. A traveler might be given scraps instead of a meal, or a cold barn instead of a bed. Some doors were slammed, no matter what the priest said. But the existence of these traditions gave travelers a chance. A wandering peasant could knock, hope the rules of hospitality applied, and sometimes they did. 10. Hospitality's decline by the late Middle Ages. As towns got bigger and travel became more common, formal inns and guest houses began to replace the old system of door-to-door hospitality. Laws shifted to suspicion of vagrants grew, and charity became more organized through guilds and hospitals. But in earlier centuries, those customs and religious expectations really mattered. Without them, countless poor peasants might never have survived their journeys. Wrapping up the laws of hospitality. So, while the reality wasn't always rosy, hospitality laws and traditions offered peasants one of their few lifelines on the road. The system wasn't perfect, but it meant that knocking on a door or showing up at a church gave you at least a chance of shelter, and that chance could be the difference between waking up in a barn or not waking up at all after a freezing night outdoors. Next, well, look at what people actually brought with them on these journeys. Spoiler: no suitcases, no rolling bags, and definitely no travel pillows. Just the bare essentials, and even that wasn't much. What peasants packed for the road so far. We've talked about where peasants stayed on their journeys, but here is another big question. What did they actually bring with them? Spoiler: it wasn't much. When you're a poor medieval peasant, packing light isn't just a lifestyle choice, it's survival. Forget the idea of rolling suitcases or backpacks stuffed with gadgets. Medieval peasants had only the bare essentials, carried in whatever they could manage. And since most of them didn't even own bags, packing often meant stuffing things into a pouch, a bundle, or just tying it all to a stick. 1. No fancy luggage. Let's start with the obvious. Peasants didn't have luggage sets. No leather trunks with brass corners. No travel chests with secret compartments. If you were lucky, you had a simple sack made of rough cloth. If not, you carried things in your cloak, in your hands, or balanced on your back. Some travelers used a staff with a bundle tied to the end, basically the cartoon hobo look, not because it was funny, but because it worked. 2. Clothing. One set, maybe two. Most peasants only owned one set of clothing. At best, they might have two, one for daily wear, one for Sundays or special occasions. When traveling, they usually wore their best or at least their least ragged outfit. Extra clothes weren't usually packed. Clothes were bulky, heavy, and expensive. If you tore your shirt on the road, you patched it. If your shoes wore thin, you stuffed grass inside for padding. Travelers looked scruffy not because they wanted to, but because that was just life. 3. A cloak for everything. The one must-have item was a cloak. A cloak was like a medieval Swiss Army knife. Blanket, raincoat, pillow, ground sheet, even makeshift bag. Thick woolen cloaks were warm, water-resistant, and durable. When sleeping outside, your cloak was your bedroll. When it rained, it was your umbrella. If you needed to carry food or hay, it became a sack. Honestly, cloaks were probably the most valuable piece of clothing peasants owned. 4. Food on the road. Peasants didn't pack big meals. Instead, they brought travel-friendly foods. Bread, usually coarse, dark, and tough enough to double as a weapon. Cheese. Hard cheese lasted longer and didn't spoil quickly. Dried meat or fish, rare, but very useful if you had it. Onions or garlic, cheap, kept well, and added flavor to bland bread. Food wasn't carefully meal planned. It was whatever you had on hand, shoved into a pouch. Once it was gone, you relied on villages, markets, or charity. 5. Water and ale. Here is the tricky part: carrying liquids. Poor peasants usually didn't have fancy flasks or canteens. Some might carry a small wooden or leather flask, but many just depended on streams, wells, or alehouses along the way. And yes, ale was often safer to drink than water. Weak ale, called small beer, was common. It wasn't very alcoholic, but it was boiled during brewing, which killed off nasties in the water. A traveller might carry a little, but mostly, you just drank when you found it. 6. Tools and utensils. Some travellers carried basic tools, a small knife for cutting bread, maybe a wooden spoon, and if you were lucky, a simple pot or pan. Eating with your hands was normal, but having a knife and spoon made life easier. A belt knife, in particular, was essential. It wasn't just for food, it was your tool for cutting rope, sharpening sticks, or defending yourself if things got rough. No one left home without one. 7. Bedding and extras. A poor peasant rarely carried bedding. A cloak was enough, but if someone was lucky, they might travel with a small bundle of straw or a sheepskin to sleep on. These were luxuries, though, and most peasants just accepted that the ground would be their mattress. Other extras: a flint and steel for fire, maybe a rosary or small religious charm, sometimes a walking stick. Pilgrims carried badges or symbols of their journey, like a scallop shell, but ordinary peasants kept it simple. Light loads made long walks easier. 8. Carrying money. If any money was rare for peasants. If they had coins, they carried them in small leather pouches, often hidden under clothing for safety. Robbers knew travelers might have coin, so keeping it out of sight was smart. Sometimes peasants didn't travel with money at all. Instead, they carried small trade goods, eggs, chickens, or simple crafts that could be bartered for food or shelter. Picture someone showing up at an inn and paying for a night's floor space with a pair of hens. That was real medieval economics. 9. The weight of the load. We should remember, peasants weren't packing for vacation. Every item mattered. Too much weight slowed you down, made you tired, and wore out your shoes faster. So most people carried as little as possible. If you've ever gone camping and regretted packing 5 extra snacks, imagine doing that, but while walking 20 miles on foot in rough shoes. Medieval peasants learned fast. The lighter, the better. 10. Comparing then and now. Thinking about what peasants carried really shows how different travel was. Today, people pack phone chargers, toiletries, changes of clothes, snacks, and even neck pillows. A poor medieval traveller: bread, cheese, cloak, knife. That's about it. It sounds bleak, but it was practical. They didn't have much to lose, which made them surprisingly flexible. You can't get your suitcase lost by the airline if you never had one in the first place. Wrapping up the medieval packing list. So, what did peasants take on the road? The answer: the absolute minimum. A cloak, some bread and cheese, a knife, maybe a flask, and if fortune smiled, a bit of money or a sheepskin to sleep on. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't comfortable, but it was enough to survive the road most of the time. Next, well, look at what actually happened along those roads, because it wasn't just about where you stayed or what you carried. Traveling itself meant facing bandits, tolls, accidents, and sometimes just plain bad luck. And for peasants, every step could bring new surprises. Dangers and hardships of the road. Traveling in medieval Europe wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. For poor peasants, the road was less of an adventure and more of a gamble. Every step held the chance of trouble, and while some trips went smoothly, plenty did not. Let's take a walk together down the medieval highway and look at the dangers that kept travelers awake at night. 1. The state of the roads. First, the roads themselves. Road is honestly too generous a word for what most peasants walked on. Outside big trade routes, roads were little more than dirt tracks. When it rained, they turned into mud pits. When it was dry, they were rutted, rocky, and hard on the feet. Shoes wore out quickly, and most peasants didn't have spares. Some walked barefoot, which made blisters, cuts, and infections almost guaranteed. Just getting from one village to another could feel like a marathon in bad shoes. 2. Weather woes. We've already seen how hard sleeping outside was, but weather made the walking miserable. 2. Rain turned everything to mud, and cloaks only helped so much. Wind could chill you to the bone. Winter travel was so brutal that many peasants avoided it, unless they absolutely had no choice. And summer: hot, dusty, sweaty. No sunscreen, no bug spray, just the sun beating down and mosquitoes feasting on your arms. In short, there was no good travel season. only bad and slightly less bad. 3. Bandits and thieves. One of the biggest dangers came from people. Bandits lurked on roadsides, especially in forests or remote areas. They knew travelers were vulnerable, far from help, usually carrying food or a few coins. Peasants were less tempting targets than merchants, but that didn't make them safe. A loaf of bread or a single coin could be worth stealing. Some travelers were beaten, stripped of their clothing, or left with nothing but their lives. It wasn't only bandits, either. Desperate beggars sometimes turned to theft. Even innkeepers weren't always trustworthy. Falling asleep in the wrong tavern could mean waking up to find your pouch missing. 4. Wild animals. Animals added their own threats. Wolves still roamed much of Europe in the Middle Ages. A lone traveler could hear howls in the dark and know they were being watched. Wolves rarely attacked healthy adults, but hunger or desperation made them bold. Boars were worse, big, fast, and aggressive. They could gore a person badly. Bears were present in some regions, too. Even stray dogs could be dangerous, especially in packs. Basically, nature didn't cut peasants any slack. 5. Sickness on the road. Travel meant exposure to sickness. Drinking from dirty streams or eating spoiled food could land you with stomach troubles or worse. Cuts and blisters easily turned into infections, since peasants had no antiseptics or antibiotics. And let's not forget, medieval Europe had its fair share of plagues and epidemics. Traveling through towns meant exposure to diseases you might not find at home. Catching something on the road could be a death sentence. 6. Accidents and injuries. Sometimes the danger wasn't bandits or wolves, it was just bad luck. A twisted ankle on a rocky path, a fall while crossing a stream, even being kicked by a cart horse. Without proper medical care, even a minor injury could turn serious. If you were traveling alone, an accident could leave you stranded. Groups were safer not just against bandits, but against plain clumsiness. 7. Tolls and authorities. Even when people weren't trying to rob you illegally, they might rob you legally. Lords and towns often set up tolls on roads, bridges, or city gates. Everyone passing had to pay. For peasants, this was frustrating. You might only have a single coin, and suddenly half of it went to a gatekeeper with a spear. Avoiding toll roads often meant taking longer, riskier back routes. Either way, you paid, whether in money or in danger. 8. Suspicion of strangers. Travelers weren't always welcomed. Villages feared outsiders. Strangers might carry disease, spread gossip, or steal. A poor peasant showing up in a new place could be viewed with suspicion, even hostility. Some towns had curfews and gates that closed at night, meaning travelers could be locked out and forced to sleep outside. In the worst cases, strangers might be chased away altogether, left to fend for themselves. 9. Hunger and thirst. Food on the road was never guaranteed. You might run out of bread, find no inn, and face empty stomachs for a day or more. Streams weren't always nearby, and when they were, the water might not be safe. Hunger and thirst were constant companions. This is why peasants often begged at village doors. A crust of bread or a bowl of pottage could mean the difference between making it to the next town or collapsing halfway there. 10. The mental strain. Travel wasn't just physically tough, it was mentally exhausting. Imagine walking 4 days with sore feet, sleeping badly, always on guard for danger. Loneliness weighed heavily, too. Unless you were in a group, the road was quiet, and your own thoughts were often your only company. For peasants used to the routine of village life, the road was unsettling. Familiar faces and fields were left behind, replaced with uncertainty at every turn. Wrapping up the dangers. So, was travel worth it? Sometimes, yes. Pilgrims earned spiritual rewards. Seasonal workers found wages. Families visited shrines or relatives. But for peasants, the road was never easy. Mud, weather, bandits, animals, sickness, tolls, hunger, suspicion. The risks stacked up fast. That's why most peasants didn't travel far unless they had to. Journeys were slow, dangerous, and unpredictable. Every mile was a small victory, every safe night a relief. Next, we'll lighten things a little and look at pilgrimages. One of the most common reasons peasants hit the road, because while danger was always lurking, the call of holy sites was strong enough to send even the poorest peasants walking hundreds of miles. Pilgrimage and religious travel. If you were a poor peasant in medieval Europe, one of the few reasons you might leave your village for a long journey was religion. Pilgrimage was huge. It wasn't just for the rich or noble. Ordinary peasants also walked long, dusty miles to visit holy places. At first glance, this sounds kind of crazy. Life at home was already hard enough. Why would someone voluntarily take on the dangers of the road? The answer was simple: faith, hope, and sometimes a touch of adventure. 1. What was a pilgrimage? A pilgrimage was a journey to a holy site that could be a shrine, a cathedral, or the tomb of a saint. Pilgrims believed that by visiting, they could earn spiritual benefits, forgiveness of sins, healing from illness, or blessings for themselves and their families. Some shrines were local, maybe just a few miles away. Others were far away: Rome, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, even Jerusalem if you were especially ambitious. For a peasant, most pilgrimages were shorter, but even those could mean days or weeks on the road. 2. Why peasants went? Why would someone so poor and busy bother? Several reasons. Religious duty. Many felt it was a way to grow closer to God. Healing. If someone was sick, visiting a saint's relic might cure them. Penance. Sometimes priests assigned pilgrimages as a punishment for sins. Hope. In a world with few options, the promise of divine help was powerful. It wasn't all solemn, though. Pilgrimages could also be social. Groups of villagers sometimes went together, turning the trip into a kind of community event. 3. Pilgrim gear. Unlike ordinary travelers, pilgrims often carried special signs. A staff, a wide-brimmed hat, or a shell pinned to the cloak marked them out. The scallop shell was especially famous for pilgrims going to Santiago. These symbols let people know, I'm not just wandering in on a holy journey. And here is the thing, wearing pilgrim symbols made others more willing to help. Inns, monasteries, and villagers were more generous if they believed you were traveling for God. Even poor peasants could sometimes rely on charity along the way. 4. Shrines and relics. The destinations mattered. Shrines held relics, bones, clothing, or objects linked to saints. These were believed to have miraculous powers. For example, Canterbury Cathedral in England drew pilgrims to the shrine of Thomas Becket. Santiago in Spain claimed the tomb of St. James. Countless local churches had smaller relics, from scraps of cloth to drops of blood. For peasants, reaching one of these places felt like stepping into a higher world. Touching a relic or praying at a shrine could bring hope, healing, or forgiveness. 5. The journey experience. Traveling as a pilgrim wasn't easy. It was the same muddy roads, the same dangers. But there was one big difference: community. Pilgrims often walked in groups, sang songs, prayed together, and supported each other along the way. This made the journey less lonely. And honestly, it was probably one of the few times peasants got to see life beyond their own fields. 6. Hospitality for pilgrims. As we saw earlier, hospitality customs were especially strong for pilgrims. Monasteries and churches often gave free lodging and food. Towns along popular routes set up hospices just for them. Even inns sometimes offered discounts. Pilgrims weren't guaranteed comfort, but they had better odds of finding a roof than an ordinary traveler. Carrying a pilgrim badge was like carrying a medieval travel pass. 7. The risks of pilgrimage. Of course, danger didn't disappear. Pilgrims still faced bandits, bad weather, and sickness. In fact, big groups of pilgrims were tempting targets. Lots of people carrying food, coins, and maybe donations for the church. There was also the risk of exploitation. Some fake relic sellers and scam artists took advantage of pilgrims, selling worthless trinkets as holy. Peasants might spend their precious coins on something with no real value, but the belief itself still gave comfort. 8. The rewards at the end. Reaching the destination was often emotional. Imagine walking 4 days, exhausted, dirty, and hungry, then finally standing before a glittering shrine filled with candles and gold. 4 peasants used to wooden churches and bare chapels. It must have been breathtaking. The act of touching the shrine, praying, and maybe receiving a blessing felt like proof the struggle was worth it. Even if nothing miraculous happened, the memory of the journey and the faith renewed could carry someone 4 years afterward. 9. Pilgrimage culture. Pilgrimage became so common that it shaped culture. Songs, stories, and even jokes about pilgrims spread across Europe. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is the most famous example. Pilgrims swapping stories on the road. 4 peasants. Pilgrimage wasn't just about religion. It was a rare chance to step into a bigger world, meet strangers, hear news, and share experiences beyond their village. 10. Pilgrimage as escape. One last note. Sometimes, pilgrimage was a convenient excuse to get away. If life in the village was unbearable, debt, conflict, or even crime, declaring yourself a pilgrim gave you cover. People were less likely to question your wandering if you carried a shell and staff. So while most went with sincere hearts, a few used pilgrimage as medieval camouflage. Wrapping up pilgrimage for poor peasants. Pilgrimage was one of the main reasons to hit the road. It was risky, exhausting, and uncomfortable, but also uplifting. It gave them purpose, hope, and a sense of belonging to something greater. Next, we'll look at seasonal workers, peasants who traveled not for religion, but for wages. Because faith was important, but sometimes the real reason to walk 50 miles was simple: money. Seasonal workers and traveling for wages. Not every journey a poor peasant made was about faith or family. Sometimes it was about survival. Money, or rather, the lack of it, was a powerful motivator. In medieval Europe, peasants didn't often deal with piles of coins, but they did need to pay rents, taxes, and tithes. And when your harvest failed or your lord demanded more than usual, there was only one answer: pack your bag, hit the road, and look for work. This kind of travel was less about piety and more about practicality. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a lifeline. 1. Why work away from home? Most peasants spent their entire lives tied to the land, growing food and raising animals, but not every farm produced enough to keep a family going. A bad harvest could leave bellies empty and debts unpaid. That's when someone might decide to travel, at least for a season. Heading off to a nearby town, manor, or monastery meant the chance to earn extra wages, or at least food and shelter, in exchange for labor. For younger peasants, seasonal work could also be a way to escape the watchful eyes of parents or lords. Think of it like a medieval gap year, except instead of backpacking through Europe, you were hauling hay on someone else's field. 2. The types of jobs. What kind of work was out there for a traveling peasant? Quite a variety. Harvest labor. Extra hands were needed when crops ripened. Large estates hired peasants to reap and thresh. Sheep shearing, a labor-intensive job during the spring and summer. Building projects. Towns, castles, and churches often needed stone haulers, ditch diggers, or carpenters. Monastery work. Monks sometimes hired peasants to tend fields, build walls, or help with brewing and baking. Market help. Some peasants worked temporarily with merchants, loading carts or selling goods. The pay wasn't great, but even a few coins could make the difference between survival and starvation back home. 3. Payment. Not always in coins. Wages weren't always paid in money. Sometimes the reward was food, drink, or a place to sleep. A landlord might promise board and lodging for a week in exchange for heavy labor. For poor peasants, this wasn't such a bad deal. A full stomach and a roof were luxuries compared to starving in your own cottage. Plus, with luck, you might save a few scraps to bring home. 4. Traveling to market towns. Towns were magnets for seasonal workers. Markets bustled with activity, and demand for labor was high. A peasant might walk miles to the nearest town during harvest season, hoping to be hired for a week or two. It wasn't unlike modern-day labor standing around in the marketplace, waiting for someone to shout, "You there? Come help unload this cart." The jobs might be short-term, but they were better than nothing. 5. The challenges of being a worker on the road. Of course, this kind of travel wasn't easy. Seasonal workers faced all the same hardships: We've already talked about mud, weather, hunger, and danger. On top of that, there was competition. You weren't the only one looking for work, arriving in town only to find 20 other peasants already waiting by the market square just have been discouraging. Employers could be picky, underpay, or demand long hours. And let's be honest, peasants weren't exactly treated with kindness. A landowner might take advantage of desperate workers, offering less food than promised or sending them away unpaid. 6. Trust and reputation. One thing helped: reputation. If you returned year after year to the same estate or monastery, people began to trust you. A regular seasonal worker was more likely to be welcomed and treated decently. For younger peasants, these trips also built social connections. You met other workers, heard news, and sometimes even found a spouse while laboring in the fields of another village. 7. Traveling craftsmen and specialists. It wasn't only farmhands who traveled for wages. Some peasants had special skills like weaving, carpentry, or smithing. These craftsmen often moved from place to place, looking for jobs where their talents were needed. Picture a peasant carpenter walking with a bundle of tools over his shoulder. He might patch roofs in one village, then move on to the next. Skilled travelers had a little more freedom, since their work was in demand almost everywhere. 8. Monasteries as employers. Monasteries were steady sources of work. Monks owned vast lands, and while they prayed, someone else had to do the digging and ploughing. Seasonal peasants were hired for tasks like haymaking, harvesting, or maintaining roads and walls. Monks, bound by religious duty, were often, though not always, fairer than secular lords. A peasant might even get an extra loaf of bread or some ale at the end of a hard day. Compared to sleeping in a ditch, monastery work felt almost luxurious. 9. The benefits of traveling for wages. For all the risks and hardship, wage travel offered a few perks: variety, a break from the same fields and same faces back home; opportunity, the chance to earn money or favors you couldn't get otherwise; freedom, a taste of independence, even if temporary. Some peasants probably looked forward to seasonal work in a strange way. It was hard, but it was different. In a life defined by routine, difference was exciting. 10. Returning home. Eventually, the season ended, and peasants trudged back to their villages. Maybe they returned with a handful of coins, or just a full stomach and some stories to tell. Either way, the journey had served its purpose, keeping the family afloat for another year. For many, this cycle repeated: work at home, then work on the road, back and forth. Life as a seasonal laborer wasn't glamorous, but it was part of survival. Wrapping up wage travel, when we picture medieval peasants, we often imagine them tied permanently to their village. But in reality, many poor folk walked miles every year chasing work. These humble journeys kept the economy turning and put bread on the table. Next, we'll move to something a little different: fairs and festivals. Because for all the hard travel peasants did for survival, sometimes they hit the road simply to enjoy themselves. And believe it or not, medieval festivals were wild. Fairs and festivals. So far, we've followed peasants trudging through mud for survival, for faith, or because they had no choice. But sometimes, believe it or not, peasants traveled for fun. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, life wasn't all toil and misery. When a big fair or festival came to town, peasants might walk miles just to join in. These events were the medieval version of a holiday, a music festival, and a shopping mall all rolled into one. 1. What were fairs and festivals? A fair was usually a large gathering focused on trade. Merchants from faraway towns came to sell goods, and villagers from the countryside came to buy, sell, and swap. But fairs weren't just about shopping, they were social and cultural events too. Festivals, on the other hand, were tied to religion and the church calendar. Feast days for saints, Christmas, Easter, Midsummer each came with celebrations, markets, plays, and sometimes outright partying. For a peasant stuck in the same fields most days, a fair or festival was a chance to break free from routine and see the wider world. 2. The journey to a fair, traveling to a fair, could be a big deal. Villagers often went in groups, carrying whatever surplus goods they had: chickens, wool, baskets, even homemade ale. Some peasants had little to sell, but they still came along just to watch, trade gossip, and maybe snag a treat. The journey was almost as exciting as the fair itself. Walking with neighbors, joking, singing, and speculating about what exotic things they might see. It was like heading to a concert with friends. 3. The marketplace experience. Once at the fair, peasants were overwhelmed by sights and sounds. Imagine being used to small village markets, then suddenly seeing stalls filled with spices, colorful fabrics, trinkets, and strange foods you'd never tasted before. Merchants shouted to advertise their wares. Musicians played. Jugglers performed tricks. Crowds pushed and shoved. For peasants, it must have felt like stepping into another world. Even if you couldn't afford much, browsing the stalls was entertainment in itself. 4. Food and drink. One of the biggest draws was food. Fairs and festivals meant treats you couldn't get at home: honey cakes, roasted meats, spiced wine, fresh fish. Of course, most peasants didn't have money for feasts, but even a small indulgence, like a meat pie or a cup of ale, felt luxurious. And sometimes, the generosity of rich lords or guilds meant free food was handed out during feast days. For poor folk, this was a rare chance to taste the good life. 5. Entertainment. Entertainment was everywhere. Minstrels sang ballads, dancers spun in the square, traveling actors performed plays, often Bible stories, but sometimes comedies poking fun at everyday life. There were also games, wrestling matches, dice throwing, even early versions of ball games. Peasants could watch or join in. For once, laughter replaced the sound of hoes in the fields. And let's not forget the drinking. Ale flowed freely, and drunken merrymaking was practically a medieval tradition. Festivals often ended with more than a few peasants stumbling home with sore heads the next day. 6. Meeting new people. Fairs and festivals brought strangers together. Merchants came from far-off towns, travelers from other villages mingled, and suddenly peasants found themselves chatting with people they'd never otherwise meet. This meant gossip spread fast, news of wars, royal decrees, or scandals in neighboring villages. But it also meant romance. Plenty of couples met at fairs, flirting over a jug of cider, all while dancing in the square. For some, fairs were matchmaking opportunities. In a world where your marriage options were limited, seeing fresh faces at a festival was exciting. 7. Religious side of festivals. Even the wildest festivals usually had a religious core. Feast days began with processions, masses, and prayers. Pilgrims visited relics or shrines, and churches often hosted plays to teach biblical lessons. So while peasants enjoyed themselves, they also reaffirmed their faith. Religion and celebration weren't separate, they were woven together. For a medieval people, joy was a form of devotion. 2. 8. Risks at fairs. Of course, fairs weren't all fun. Crowds meant pickpockets. Drinking meant brawls. With so many people in close quarters, disease spread easily, what we'd now call a super spreader event. Prices could also be a trap. Merchants knew peasants weren't experienced shoppers, so they hiked up costs. A peasant might waste hard-earned coins on shoddy goods. And let's be honest, walking home drunk from a festival after dark wasn't exactly safe on medieval roads. 9. The emotional impact. Despite the risks, fairs and festivals were magical for peasants. They offered glimpses of a wider, more colorful world. For children especially, the sights and sounds left lasting memories. Even adults came home with renewed energy, stories to tell, and maybe a small trinket or sweet to remind them of the day. These rare bursts of joy helped balance out the grind of daily labor. 10. Festivals as social glue. On a bigger scale, fairs and festivals kept communities together. They gave peasants reasons to laugh, dance, and bond with their neighbors. They strengthened ties between villages and towns, spreading culture and ideas. For poor peasants, they were more than entertainment. They were proof that life wasn't only about hardship. There were moments of light, color, and joy. Wrapping up festivals. So, While poor peasants often traveled out of need, sometimes they walked those muddy roads just for fun. Fairs and festivals were the highlights of the year, loud, messy, joyous escapes from routine. Next, we'll explore family visits and obligations, because not every journey was about money, God, or merrymaking. Sometimes, you just had to go see your cousin in the next village, whether you wanted to or not. Family visits and obligations. Not every journey a poor peasant made was about survival, religion, or fun. Sometimes, it was about family. In a world where families were large, close-knit, and spread across multiple villages, there were plenty of reasons to travel, just to see relatives, or to answer the endless call of family obligations. If fairs and festivals were the medieval version of a holiday, then family visits were the medieval version of being guilt-tripped into visiting your aunt. 1. Family spread across villages. Most peasants lived in small villages, but marriage, work, or misfortune often scattered relatives. A brother might marry into another village, a daughter might move to her husband's land, or an uncle might work on a nearby estate. That meant if you wanted to see family, you had to walk. There were no carriages for poor peasants, no quick horse rides, just miles of road, mud, and aching feet. 2. Reasons to visit. Why go through all that trouble? Lots of reasons. Weddings. Family members were expected to attend, even if it meant days of walking. Funerals. Death was frequent in the Middle Ages, and families showed up to mourn. Births and christenings. A new baby meant gathering to celebrate, and godparents often traveled. Helping out. Harvests, illness, or building projects often called for family labor. Basically, whenever something big happened in the family, there was an unspoken rule: show up. 3. The social pressure. Family ties were strong, and ignoring them wasn't really an option. Not turning up for a wedding or funeral could cause rifts that lasted years. Even poor peasants, who hated leaving their land unattended, often felt compelled to go. So, journeys weren't always joyful or chosen, they were sometimes about duty. 4. The hospitality factor. The upside. Visiting family meant you didn't have to worry as much about where to stay. A cousin or sibling's cottage might be cramped, smoky, and loud, but at least it was a roof. Hospitality among relatives was expected. You might get a straw mattress in the corner, a shared blanket, and a bowl of stew. Not luxurious, but far better than a roadside ditch. 5. Family gossip and news. Visits weren't just about big events, they were also how peasants shared news. Remember, no phones, no letters for ordinary folk. If you wanted to know how your sister's family was doing to villages over, you had to walk there. These visits spread gossip, news of marriages, disputes, and sometimes even political events. Family ties doubled as medieval news networks. 6. Helping hands. One big reason for family travel was labor. If one family faced a big harvest, they might call in cousins from another village to help. In return, they'd later go and help with their harvest. This back and forth of labor kept families alive during tough seasons. So travel wasn't just social, it was economic teamwork. 7. Pilgrim excuses. Sometimes family visits were paired with pilgrimages. A peasant might plan a religious journey that just happened to pass by a cousin's village. 2 birds, 1 stone. Earn spiritual credit and keep up family ties. 8. The challenges of family travel. Of course, even family visits had their hardships. The roads were still long, weather still unforgiving, and danger still present. A quick visit to a cousin could take days of walking. Plus, not all family visits were pleasant. Imagine walking 20 miles just to be nagged about not visiting sooner, or being pressured into helping with chores you didn't want to do. Some things never change. 9. Special occasions. Certain family events were especially important. Weddings. These could last days, with dancing, drinking, and feasting. Peasants didn't want to miss the rare chance for celebration. Funerals. These brought together far-flung kin. Mourning was communal, and absence could be seen as disrespect. Seasonal festivals. Families often used fairs and feast days as excuses to reunite. These gatherings helped peasants feel part of something larger, than just their household. 10. The emotional side. Family visits carried deep emotional weight. For peasants who rarely traveled, seeing distant siblings or children who had married away was a rare joy. These visits reminded them that they weren't alone in a harsh world. Even short reunions, sharing a meal, swapping stories, watching children play together were cherished memories. For peasants who lived with constant uncertainty, family visits provided comfort and connection. Wrapping up family journeys. So, not all peasant travel was about survival or adventure. Sometimes, it was simply about family showing up when needed, helping when asked, and keeping ties strong across muddy miles. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't always fun, but family was the glue that held peasant life together. Next, we'll turn to chapter 14, law, justice, and court appearances, because sometimes peasants didn't travel by choice at all. Sometimes, they were summoned. Law, justice, and court appearances. Sometimes peasants traveled for faith, sometimes for work, sometimes for family. But there was one type of journey no one really looked forward to: the trip to court. In medieval Europe, even the poorest peasants could find themselves summoned to appear before a lord, a bishop, or a town magistrate. And when the law called, you had no choice but to pack your bag and start walking. It wasn't exactly a glamorous road trip. Court travel was stressful, confusing, and often expensive, but it was part of life, even for the poorest. 1. Why peasants went to court. There were a surprising number of reasons a peasant might have to travel for justice: disputes over land, whose cow ate whose crops, or who owned a strip of field; taxes and rents. If a lord claimed you owed more than you thought, expect to be summoned. Crimes, theft, assault, drunken brawls. Peasants could be defendants or witnesses. Church matters, disputes over tithes, marriages, or moral offences went to church courts. Jury duty, yes, even peasants sometimes served as jurors or witnesses in local cases. In short, the law reached into even the smallest huts. 2. Manorial courts. Most peasants first dealt with manorial courts, run by the local lord or his steward. These were held in nearby villages or manor houses. Attending still meant travel, maybe just a few miles, but enough to be a hassle when you had chores waiting at home. Manorial courts dealt with small disputes, broken fences, unpaid rents, fights between neighbors. Punishments were usually fines, which peasants hated but couldn't escape. 3. Church courts. Then there were church courts, which covered spiritual and moral matters. Did someone skip paying their tithe? Accused of blasphemy? Got caught in a scandal? Off to the bishop's court you went. These courts often meant longer travel, since the bishop's seat was usually in a town or city. For a poor peasant, this could mean days of walking just to answer a complaint. 4. Royal courts and serious matters. For bigger cases, serious crimes, land disputes involving multiple lords, or appeals, peasants might have to appear in royal courts. These were often held in major towns, far from home. The journey could take weeks. Imagine leaving your family behind, walking on dangerous roads, all while worrying about what the judge might say when you got there. Not exactly a relaxing trip. 5. The burden of traveling to court was a heavy burden. You lost valuable work time, meaning your crops or animals suffered. You had to pay for food and lodging along the way, or beg for shelter. And once you arrived, you often faced long waits, since courts didn't always run on schedule. For peasants living hand to mouth, this wasn't just inconvenient, it could push a family into hunger or debt. 6. How peasants prepared. So how did peasants get ready for a court journey? Usually by packing the basics: bread, cheese, maybe dried fish if they had it. If lucky, they went with neighbors who also had cases, since traveling in groups was safer. They might carry a small pouch of coins if they could scrape them together, because fines and fees were almost guaranteed. And if they had to present evidence, like a broken tool or a neighbor's fence post, they brought that too. Imagine trudging 20 miles, holding a fence post to prove your point. 7. Hospitality and lodging. Once again, monasteries and churches offered some relief. Pilgrim hostels sometimes took in court-goers, since everyone on the road needed shelter. But inns near towns and cities smelled opportunity. They charged peasants for straw beds and watery ale, making the justice journey even more expensive. Some peasants slept rough to avoid the costs, huddling outside town walls until their court date. 8. The intimidation factor for poor peasants. Courts were intimidating. Lords in fine robes, bishops in glittering vestments, clerks scribbling in Latin, all of it was strange and overwhelming. Most peasants couldn't read or write, so they relied on memory, witnesses, or sheer honesty. Some courts were fair, but others were biased toward the wealthy. A peasant walking into court often knew they didn't stand much of a chance. 9. Punishments and outcomes. So what happened after all that travel? Most often, fines. Courts loved money, and peasants were an easy source of it. Couldn't pay right away. The debt would hang over you until you could. Other punishments included public humiliation, like standing in the stocks. Serious crimes could lead to harsher penalties, whippings, mutilations, or even death, but for everyday disputes, fines were the norm. Still, peasants had to show up, or risk worse trouble. Dodging a summons could bring even heavier penalties. 10. The emotional toll. Court journeys weren't just exhausting, they were frightening. For peasants used to small village life, walking into a big town or facing a stern lord was nerve-wracking. The uncertainty made it worse. You could walk 4 days, spend your last coin, and still lose the case. No wonder many peasants dreaded the knock on the door telling them to appear. Wrapping up justice travel for poor peasants, journeys to courts were some of the most unpleasant trips of all. They were costly, stressful, and often ended badly, but they were also unavoidable. Justice, fair or not, demanded their presence. Still, these legal journeys remind us that even the humblest peasants weren't invisible. Their disputes, debts, and actions mattered enough that the machinery of law dragged them onto the road. Next, we'll head into chapter 15, long-distance journeys and rare adventures, because, while most peasant travel was short, sometimes, just sometimes, poor folk ventured far beyond their villages, and those stories are worth telling. Long-distance journeys and rare adventures. Most of the time, peasants didn't go far. Their whole world was their village, the fields, the church, and maybe the nearest market town. But every once in a while, something extraordinary happened. A poor peasant found themselves on a long journey. Maybe it was for faith, maybe for fortune, maybe just plain bad luck. These long-distance trips were rare, but they show us another side of medieval life. The peasant as traveler, even adventurer. 1. The pilgrimage that never ended. Pilgrimage was the most common excuse for long-distance travel. Most peasants stuck to local shrines, but a few ambitious or very devoted souls walked hundreds of miles to reach famous holy sites. Imagine a barefoot villager trudging across France to see the shrine of St. James in Santiago de Compostela, or a group of English peasants, pockets empty, slowly making their way to Rome. These journeys could take months, even years. It wasn't glamorous, just endless walking, sore feet, and a constant worrying about food. But for the devout, the reward of reaching such a holy place was worth it. 2. War and military service. Sometimes, peasants were pulled into long journeys by war, drafted into a lord's army, or volunteering in hopes of pay. They might march far from home. Campaigns could drag peasants hundreds of miles away, sometimes across the sea on crusade. For most, this was terrifying. They had little training, poor equipment, and no guarantee they'd ever come home. But for some, it was the only time they ever saw the wider world. 3. Famine and desperation. Hunger could drive peasants to desperate measures. During bad harvests, whole families might leave their villages in search of food or work. These journeys weren't adventurous, they were heartbreaking. People wandered from town to town, begging for bread, hoping to find a place to survive. Chroniclers sometimes describe ragged bands of peasants drifting across the countryside, sleeping under hedges, moving from village to village. These were long journeys, but born of desperation, not choice. 4. Joining a band of travelers. Every now and then, peasants joined traveling groups, peddlers, entertainers, or even wandering friars. These bands moved between villages and towns, making a living on the road. A poor peasant with no land might tag along, carrying goods or performing odd jobs. It wasn't stable, but it was freedom. For a handful of peasants, life on the road became their new normal. 5. The Crusades and beyond. Let's not forget the biggest adventures of all, the Crusades. Though most crusaders were knights and nobles, some peasants joined too, either swept up by religious fervor or hoping for wealth. These long journeys took peasants across Europe and into the Middle East, a distance unimaginable for someone used to walking only to the next town. Many never returned, but the idea that even a poor peasant could travel to distant lands shows how wide the medieval world could be. 6. Accidental long journeys. Sometimes peasants traveled far simply because life threw them into strange situations. A runaway serf might flee dozens of miles to escape their lord. Captured in war, they might be dragged across the country as prisoners, or sold as laborers. They might be shipped to entirely new regions. Not all long journeys were chosen, but they still carried peasants far beyond their villages. 7. The stories they brought home. For peasants who did return from faraway travels, they brought back more than just sore feet. They carried stories, tales of foreign markets, strange foods, giant cities, or holy relics fascinated their neighbors. Imagine sitting in a smoky cottage, listening to a cousin describe a cathedral so tall it scraped the sky, or a town with more people than you'd ever dreamed of. For villagers who never left, these stories were their only glimpse of the wider world. 8. The risks of rare adventures. Of course, these long journeys carried serious risks. Roads were dangerous, food was scarce, and strangers weren't always kind. A peasant traveling hundreds of miles risked death from disease, hunger, or robbery at every turn. That's why most peasants never attempted it. The risk often outweighed the reward, but those who did were remembered, their stories retold long after. 9. The dream of travel. Even if most never went, the idea of long-distance travel lingered. Pilgrims came through villages with badges from faraway shrines. Soldiers returned with scars and tales of battles abroad. Merchants rattled off strange names of cities and seas. These hints kept alive a sense of the bigger world. For poor peasants, travel was both terrifying and tantalizing, a dream that usually stayed a dream. Wrapping up the rare adventures. So, while most peasants spent their lives within a few muddy miles, there were exceptions. Pilgrims, soldiers, wanderers, and desperate souls sometimes walked hundreds of miles, even crossing seas. These long-distance journeys were rare, risky, and often dangerous, but they remind us that peasants weren't completely bound to their villages. Sometimes, by choice or by force, even the poorest people of the Middle Ages became travelers in a vast, unpredictable world. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through peasant travel. From sleeping in ditches to crashing at monasteries, from visiting family to trudging to court, we've seen just how hard and uncertain life on the road was. So next time you complain about a delayed flight or a bad hotel room, just remember, it could be worse. You could be a medieval peasant, walking barefoot 4 days, only to sleep in a haystack. Sweet dreams.